8 words from a decorated war veteran made Ellen DeGeneres forget she was hosting a television show. But it wasn't the words themselves that broke her. It was the weight of 23 years of silence finally lifting from a father's shoulders. The moment those words left his lips, Ellen's microphone slipped from her trembling hand, hitting the studio floor with a hollow thud that echoed through the stunned silence. For 47 seconds, America's most beloved talk show host couldn't speak, couldn't move, could barely breathe. Because sometimes the most powerful truths aren't meant for television, they're meant to heal souls. The cameras kept rolling, but this wasn't entertainment anymore. This was a reckoning, 23 years in the making, witnessed by 300 people who had come expecting laughter and left understanding something profound about sacrifice, guilt, and the weight of secrets that soldiers carry home from war. Let me take you back to how we got to that moment of absolute silence. It was Thursday morning at Stage 1 on the Warner Brothers lot in Burbank. Ellen DeGeneres was preparing to tape what should have been a routine Veterans Day tribute episode, the kind she had done dozens of times over her nearly 2-decade run. The atmosphere was celebratory, red, white, and blue decorations throughout the studio, a military honor guard waiting backstage, and an audience filled with veterans and their families. Staff Sergeant Michael "Tank" Rodriguez sat in the green room, adjusting his dress uniform for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. At 45, he carried himself with the rigid posture that 23 years of military service had drilled into his bone. His chest displayed an impressive array of ribbons and medals: Purple Heart, Bronze Star Combat Infantry Badge, and the Silver Star that caught the studio lights just so. To anyone looking, he was the picture of military pride and honor. But Ellen had noticed something during the pre-interview that her producers had missed. It was in the way Tank's hands shook slightly when he talked about his service. The way his eyes would drift away when asked about his proudest military moment. The way he clutched a folded piece of paper in his pocket like it contained either salvation or damnation. "Tank, can I call you Tank?" Ellen had asked during their brief backstage meeting, using the nickname his unit had given him for his ability to push through any obstacle. "Yes, ma'am, everyone calls me Tank," he had replied in the clipped, respectful tone of a career soldier addressing a superior. "Tank, you seem nervous. You've probably faced scarier things than a daytime talk show, right?" Ellen had tried to lighten the mood with her characteristic warmth. Tank had forced a smile, but Ellen caught something in his expression, a flicker of pain so deep it made her breath catch. "Some battles are harder than others, ma'am. Some enemies you can't see coming." Now, sitting across from him on the familiar set, Ellen began the segment with her usual blend of respect and curiosity. The audience was warm and appreciative as she introduced Tank, reading his impressive military resume: 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, recipient of numerous commendations for valor, and currently working as a counselor, helping other veterans transition to civilian life. "Tank, thank you for your service," Ellen began, and the audience erupted in appreciative applause. 23 years in the military, that's incredible dedication. What are you most proud of from your time serving our country? It was a standard question, the kind she had asked hundreds of veterans over the years. The kind that usually led to stories of camaraderie, missions accomplished, lives saved. Tank should have had a ready answer. Instead, he stared down at his hands, his jaw working as if he were chewing words too difficult to swallow. "Ma'am, Tank started, then stopped. He looked up at Ellen, and she saw something that made her sit forward in her chair. It wasn't pride in his eye. It was guilt so heavy it seemed to physically weigh him down. "I've been carrying something for 23 years, something I've never told my wife, my kids, my therapist. Nobody." The studio audience quieted, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Ellen's interviewer instincts told her to redirect, to keep things light, to maintain the celebratory tone of Veterans Day. But something deeper, something more important than television, made her lean forward and give Tank her complete attention. "What is it, Tank?" she asked softly, her voice gentle but strong enough to carry across the now silent studio. Tank reached into his pocket and pulled out that folded piece of paper Ellen had noticed earlier. His hands were shaking as he held it, and Ellen could see it was worn soft from years of handling, as if he had taken it out and held it countless times but never found the courage to unfold it completely. "This is a letter," Tank said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A letter I was supposed to deliver 23 years ago, to a mother whose son died in my unit. Died because of a decision I made." The studio fell completely silent. Even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath. Ellen felt her heart rate quicken, understanding instinctively that they were approaching something sacred and terrible. "Tank," Ellen said gently, "you don't have to." "I do," Tank interrupted, his voice gaining strength. "I've been dying inside for 23 years. My marriage is falling apart because I can't connect with my family. My kids think I don't love them because I can't show emotion. I can't sleep, can't eat, can't live. Because I've been carrying this kid's death like a stone in my chest." Tank's voice cracked, and Ellen saw tears forming in his eyes, the first emotion she had seen from this stoic soldier. The audience was completely still, understanding they were witnessing something far more important than entertainment. "What happened, Tank?" Ellen asked, and her voice was so gentle it might have been a prayer. Tank took a shuddering breath and began to speak, his words coming out in a rush as if a dam had finally burst after decades of holding back an ocean. His name was Danny Morrison, 19 years old, kid from Iowa. Joined the army to help pay for college so he could become a teacher. Sweetest kid you ever met, always sharing pictures of his girlfriend, talking about the kids he was going to teach someday. Tank's voice broke completely. "He was like a son to me." Ellen reached across and took Tank's free hand in both of hers. "What happened to Danny?" "We were on patrol in Kandahar. Intelligence said there was an IED on the main road, so I made the call to take the alternate route. I was the squad leader. It was my decision. But the alternate route." Tank closed his eyes, reliving a moment that had played in his nightmares for over 2 decades. "There were 2 IEDs. We hit the first one, and Danny was thrown from the vehicle. He was hurt bad, bleeding internally, but he was alive, conscious." The studio was so quiet that the air conditioning seemed deafening. Ellen squeezed Tank's hand tighter, anchoring him to the present, while he walked back through his darkest memory. "We called for medevac, but it was going to be 45 minutes, maybe an hour. Danny was fading fast and he knew it. He knew he wasn't going to make it home." Tank's voice dropped to barely audible. "So he asked me to write a letter to his mom, his last words for her." Tank held up the folded paper with trembling hands. "He told me what to write, every word, about how much he loved her, how proud he was to be her son, how sorry he was that he wouldn't be coming home to walk her down the aisle when she remarried. She'd been dating this guy, Jerry, who Danny really liked. He wanted her to know it was okay to be happy." Ellen felt tears streaming down her face, but she didn't let go of Tank's hand. The audience was openly crying now, but no one made a sound. "He died in my arms before the helicopter got there," Tank continued, "and I promised a dying 19-year-old kid, that I would make sure his mother got his words, that I would tell her how brave he was, how he spent his last minutes thinking about her happiness instead of his own pain." Tank's whole body was shaking now, the rigid military posture, finally cracking under the weight of decades of guilt. "But when I got stateside, when I looked up Mrs. Morrison's address, I couldn't do it. I couldn't knock on that door and tell a mother that her son was dead because of a decision I made, because I chose the wrong road." Ellen stood up slowly, and did something she had never done in nearly 20 years of television. She walked around the coffee table and sat on the edge of Tank's chair, wrapping her arms around him as he broke down completely. "Tank," she whispered, loud enough for the microphones to pick up. "It wasn't your fault. You were trying to keep your unit safe. But what if I had chosen the main road?" Tank sobbed into Ellen's shoulder. "What if Danny was alive because I made a different choice? What if he got to come home and teach those kids, and marry his girlfriend, and walk his mom down the aisle?" Ellen pulled back and looked directly into Tank's eyes. "What if you had taken the main road and lost your entire unit instead of just Danny? What if you had made the right choice and 10 families lost their sons instead of 1? You were 19 years old yourself, Tank. You were a kid, trying to bring other kids home safely." For the first time since he had started talking, Tank looked directly at Ellen. But I promised him. I promised Danny I would give his mother his words, and instead I've carried them like a secret shame for 23 years. She has a right to know what her son said. She has a right to know he died thinking about her happiness. Ellen looked at Tank for a long moment, then turned to address the audience and the cameras directly. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to do something we've never done before. We're going to help Tank keep a promise that should have been kept 23 years ago. She turned back to Tank. Do you have Mrs. Morrison's contact information? Tank nodded, pulling out his phone. I've kept track of her all these years. Never reached out, but I know where she lives. She's 67 now, still living in Iowa, still unmarried. Turns out Jerry died of cancer 5 years after Danny was killed. Ellen made a decision that would change television history. Tank, I want you to call her, right now, on this stage. And I want you to read her Danny's letter, not because it will make good television, but because a dying 19-year-old boy asked you to deliver a message, and his mother has been waiting 23 years to receive it. What happened next transcended anything that had ever aired on daytime television. Tank dialed Miss Morrison's number with shaking hands while Ellen held the phone steady. The entire studio held its breath as it rang once, twice, 3 times. Hello, came a soft voice through the speaker. Mrs. Morrison? Tank's voice cracked. This is Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez. I served with your son Danny in Afghanistan. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening, then barely audible. Danny? You knew my Danny? Yes, ma'am. I was his squad leader. Mrs. Morrison, I have something for you. Something I should have given you 23 years ago. Ellen watched as Tank unfolded the letter with reverent care, his hands steadier now than they had been all day. When he began to read, his voice was clear and strong for the first time since the interview began. Mom, if you're hearing this, it means I didn't make it home. But I want you to know that I'm not scared, and I'm not in pain anymore. I'm thinking about you, about your laugh, about the way you used to sing while you cooked Sunday dinner. I'm thinking about Jerry and how happy you were when you started dating him. Mom, I need you to know something. It's okay to marry him. It's okay to be happy. I know you think you have to keep grieving for me, but the greatest gift you could give me is to live a full, joyful life. Through the phone speaker, they could hear Mrs. Morrison sobbing, but Tank continued reading in Danny's words. I want you to marry Jerry if he asks. I want you to travel like you always talked about. I want you to spoil your grandkids someday. Even if they're not mine, they'll be yours, and that's what matters. Don't spend your life missing me, Mom. Spend it living for both of us. Tank's voice broke as he read the final lines. I love you more than all the stars in the sky. Just like I used to tell you when I was little. Take care of yourself, Mom. Be happy. That's an order from your soldier boy. Love, Dan. The silence that followed was profound. Mrs. Morrison was crying so hard she couldn't speak. Tank was crying. Ellen was crying. The entire audience was crying. Even the camera operators had tears streaming down their faces. Finally, Miss Morrison's voice came through the speaker. Broken, but full of a love that had waited 23 years to be expressed. Thank you for keeping his words safe all these years. Thank you for bringing my baby back to me one more time. Miss Morrison, Tank said through his tears, I'm so sorry it took me so long. I'm sorry I was too ashamed to give you his words when you needed them most. Oh, honey. Mrs. Morrison's voice was like a mother comforting a child. You were just a baby yourself. You brought him home to me today, and that's all that matters. Danny would be so proud of you for finally finding the courage to call. Ellen stood up and addressed the audience, her voice thick with emotion. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do isn't charging into battle or facing an enemy. Sometimes it's picking up the phone and keeping a promise we're afraid to keep. Sometimes courage looks like delivering love that we've been carrying for decades. She turned back to Tank, who was still holding the phone. Tank, how do you feel? For the first time since the interview began, Tank smiled. A real, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. Lighter, he said simply, like I can breathe again for the first time in 23 years. Mrs. Morrison's voice came through the speaker one more time. Sergeant Rodriguez, I have something to tell you too. I want you to know that Danny's death wasn't your fault. You made the best decision you could with the information you had. You brought him home in the only way that mattered. You kept his love safe and delivered it when I needed to hear it most. The episode aired 2 weeks later and became the highest-rated Ellen DeGeneres show in the series' history. But more importantly, it sparked a national conversation about PTSD survivors' guilt and the importance of keeping promises to the fallen. Tank and Mrs. Morrison, Mary, as she insisted he call her, developed a relationship that helped them both heal. Tank finally started sleeping through the night. His marriage, which had been hanging by a thread, began to strengthen as he learned to open his heart to his family, the way he had finally opened it to Mary Morrison. Mary, who had spent 23 years wondering what her son's final thoughts had been, finally found peace. She framed Danny's letter and hung it next to his military portrait. But more importantly, she finally felt permission to live the life Danny had wanted for her. The Veterans Administration used the episode in PTSD treatment programs, showing veterans that carrying guilt doesn't honor the fallen, living fully honors them. Tank became a spokesperson for veteran mental health, traveling the country to speak about the importance of sharing our deepest burdens rather than carrying them alone. But perhaps the most profound impact was on Ellen herself. That episode changed how she approached every interview, every story, every moment in front of the camera. She realized that her job wasn't to entertain, it was to create space for truth, healing, and human connection. In her final season, Ellen often returned to that moment when Tank's 8 words, "I've been carrying something for 23 years, reminded her what television could be at its very best. Not performance, but presence. Not entertainment, but truth. Not distraction, but healing." The letter Tank had carried for 23 years now sits in the Smithsonian's collection of American military artifacts, not as a relic of war, but as a testament to love, courage, and the power of keeping promises, even when keeping them terrifies us. Tank Rodriguez served his country for 23 years, but his greatest act of service came when he found the courage to pick up a phone and deliver a love letter that had been waiting decades to reach its destination. Danny Morrison died at 19, but his words of love and permission to be happy continued to heal hearts 23 years later. Ellen DeGeneres built her career on making people laugh, but that Thursday morning in studio, she did something more important. She helped a promise keeper find his courage, a grieving mother find her peace, and all of us understand what it really means to honor those we've lost, not by carrying guilt, but by carrying love forward. Because sometimes the heaviest thing we carry isn't what we've done wrong, it's the love we're afraid to deliver. And sometimes the most powerful act of service isn't dying for others, it's finding the courage to live for them, to speak for them, to love for them long after they're gone. The ripple effects of that single phone call continued for years. Tank's story became a catalyst for change in how the military handles survivors' guilt and post-traumatic stress. The Department of Veterans Affairs implemented new protocols for soldiers struggling with similar burdens, creating support groups specifically for those carrying messages or memories from fallen comrades. Mary Morrison, at 67, finally began living the life her son had wanted for her. She started volunteering at a local elementary school, sharing Danny's dream of teaching with children who needed extra support. She joined a travel group and visited Ireland, the trip she and Jerry had planned but never taken. Most importantly, she began dating again, a kind widower named Frank, who understood that her heart was big enough to love both her past and her future. Tank's wife Maria later said that the man who came home from the Ellen show was the husband she had married 24 years earlier, the one who could laugh freely, hug his children without hesitation, and sleep peacefully through the night. Their teenage daughter Sophia wrote in her college application essay about watching her father transform from a man haunted by silence to one empowered by truth. The episode became required viewing in military leadership training programs, teaching young officers that the heaviest casualties of war aren't always physical, sometimes they're the secrets we carry home. Tank began speaking at military academies, sharing Danny's story not as a tale of guilt, but as a lesson in the healing power of fulfilled promises. Ellen kept Danny's original letter in a frame on her desk for the remainder of her show's run, not as a trophy or memento, but as a daily reminder that the most important conversations happen when we stop performing and start connecting. She often said that Tank taught her the difference between being a host and being human, and that being human was infinitely more important.